Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Holem, and I'm the owner of Amy's Audio Subliminal Acoustic Fingerprinting. What my company does is I investigate specific crimes from child human sex trafficking rings, stalking, harassment, and even the use of directed energy weapons and their network systems. So, what I'm going over today is more on the directed energy weapon side and the thermal tomography and the absorption of the radiation inside of a person's body. Now, when we're using thermal tomography, it is key to identify the use of the directed weapon systems and the physical attacks, both on the victim's body. So, there's going to be key things. Thermal imaging. What can some of those thermal imaging pick up? Well, for first off, it picks up different thermal radiation. It picks up heat signatures. You can convert the infrared radiation into different visible images. It can pick up different aerosols, smokes, dust, mist, and visible radiation that is happening within your surrounding area. Now, a lot of these applications of the radiation, it is visible within the thermal imager, and it's because the luminescence of the infrared components and the electromagnetic within the electromagnetic spectrums. Now, these spectrums include different microwave radiation, infrared light from solar technology systems, laser technology systems, and electromagnetic attacks on a person's body. Now, the thermal imaging also helps detect different patterns. It helps diagnose and monitor pain. It can, that's occurring within the body. So if they're hitting an area within the spine, it will show up as inflammation within that spine. Physical wounds heal. They do have a specific time frame on that for the physical attributes of the body. Usually that could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. And that depends on the location of the body, how person's metabolism, their cellular regeneration. Um, but a lot of this thermal tomography is used by the ISO standardization practices. So we'll talk about a little bit about that as well. Okay. So the first type of scan that I usually do, this is an optional one. I do audio analysis for the victims, and I can pick up different communications with inside the thermal and add this into the thermal report for verification purposes, because the audio analysis identifies the different weapon systems. Are they using lasers? What color of lasers are they using? There's a difference between red, blue, green, yellow, purple, orange and red. You could even combine it. You could make white lasers, or you could do like a brown or black lasers, depending all on the different types of wavelength. And each color spectrum has a different and particular use with that. So identifying it on the audio side and analyzing the different spectrums here, we can identify who is communicating with who. Are they satellite systems? Are they ground stations? Are there underground water communications, or maybe an underground bunker? Where are they being transmitted from? Satellite communications are going to be up here, airplanes, drones more down at the bottom. Then you have your ground station and underwater communication systems. So we could identify who is talking to who, what type of weapon systems that you're using, and what type of software and networks server. We could even get different forms of equipment with that. Now, that also gives the information on the weapon systems for the different pulse systems as well. We could determine if it is a continuous wave or if it's a pulse, or maybe that if it's a vacuum used, or maybe it's electronically powered generated, or maybe I could hear the convection processing with inside of the drones and can tell if it's gas operated or solar operated. So there's a lot of different types of things that we can learn within the audio side. It's not necessary, but it's one of those things that I do when I do a thermal tomography scan. The first scan that I perform within my thermal tomography scan is a quantum resonance scan. And what this does is it gives me key information internally about the victim's body. Because the radiation affects the body and it could destroy different cells. It could destroy your tissues. It could cause complications like that inflammation. So we want to scan the body internally and define different areas and key aspects here. What some of the key information that I look for particularly are vitamin deficiencies, heavy metals inside the body, what can be used as a conductor, what can be used as a semiconductor, evidence of the electromagnetic radiation. It proves different human toxins in there, like pesticides or nicotine, or if you're even drinking down here. So you can find different items and ranges. And as you can see, this person, the electromagnetic radiation was in a common level, lower. And so it's within the normal range. But here, the lead, the victim has high amounts of lead inside the body. There shouldn't be any lead inside the body. There's high amounts of mercury inside the bottom. All of these, there's high amounts of cadmium in there. All of these are neurotransmitters and can be used as conductors. Also, for women, I hate to say this, when you dye your hair, or men dye their hair as well, you get a lot of aluminum that goes inside the brain, and it can seep in there and it can destroy your cells and your nerves inside of the brain. So noticing people's movements, how that product got into their body is the key feature too. We could prove different cysts and lesions inside of the body scan, different tumors inside the body scan. With directed energy weapons, there is a lot of sexual assault, especially in the groin area. They destroy the ovaries of the women and the female. They also leave lesions inside of the body, scarring the tissue and proving damage and rape inside of each of every single victim as well. So using a quantum resonance scan, we could find out some key matching features. We could determine different oxygen levels within inside of the bloodstream. We can prove connections within the heart, the brain, and the spine. We can determine different glucose levels, sugar levels. Sugar is highly used for sugar. Your glucose and your protein are highly used for nanotechnology systems, graphite, in order to manipulate a person's DNA structure. So when that radiation is absorbed, a lot of the different chemicals inside the body, and your body will have a different reaction, and it will be conducted in different ways. So that you could start manipulating different areas of the body too, like dehydration. If a person is severely dehydrated, it makes it easier for the weapon systems to manipulate the tendons and force body movements within their metacarpal tendons or their Achilles heel or different muscles within inside the arm to where they would pulsate or palpitate at all. So for instance, another thing that this type of scan could show is allergy sources. A lot of my victims that I'm scanning, especially on the Havana syndrome side, with the victims, show positive for a milk allergy. That milk allergy is actually from the radiation and the inflammation inside of the breast. because they're hitting that lymph nodes. And what radiation does is cause inflammation and heat expansion. And once that heat expansion is accumulated inside of the body, it creates also a second or third harmonic frequency. And that is how they would manipulate that radiation inside the body. And they can cause your milk production to decrease and to have complications further down the road, like breast cancer. So, a lot of that, my clients are not allergic to milk, and they would have this as a positive result for that on the allergy side. So, when we're doing the internal body scans and I'm scanning all the different victims from the Havana and directing energy weapons, it's good to know what part of the body, what's being affected, and how ways to help them out. Like magnesium. Magnesium can be used as an explosive. So can iron. Iron can be used as a conductor too. If you know a lot about electronics, you can take a nail and tie it to two lemons and connect a battery in there, and you can cause that nail to heat up. It's a heat absorber. So they would use that iron to store that energy from that weapon system to help accumulate a lot of the attacks. So my next form of examination is a physical examination. When I analyze the body, this type of process actually takes about 1.5 hours to 2 hours to examine. And it usually goes a lot faster when you have two people helping out with the examination. There's only really two items you need, and that is a measuring tape and an RGB camera. You could get that with any form of camera system. Just make sure that it has RGB components, and that way you would always be able to. A lot of that can be found on SDR cameras. So just make sure that it has that capability in it, because otherwise it might be harder to identify the wounds here. Here we have two different pictures. We have one without a flash and one with flash. So you want to make sure when you're taking the photos that you take different types of photos, because you're examining this person's body inside of a room. So you want to make sure that you're using it with a flash, without a flash. You want to try different angles in order to pick up or at least identify the wounds on the body and the key areas and the components here. Here we have a lot of different weapon systems. The measuring tape helps with the physical wound attributes. That could give out size, it could give out shape, it could identify a different key position here. For instance, so the measuring tape, you would be able to determine if that's a millimeter or micrometer, an inch, a half inch. And knowing the proximity is very, very important when you're identifying directed energy weapon systems, because this is how we would be able to rebuild and reconstruct that weapon system, and to make sure that it has, I'll be talking about that a little bit later regarding that. So with this, not all physical wounds are identifiable to the naked eye. Some could only be brought out by different processing, forensic processing, that could be due to a person's skin color. It could be deal with toning. It could deal with lighting, ethnicity of the skin. It could deal with different brightness levels. So when forensic processing inside, when you're correlating the different images and the physical wounds, it's always great to take 3 to 5 sets of those images. And that way you could always make a proper assumption when you're examining the thermal images as well, to prove that radiation inside that person's body. once the wounds have been identified, you can determine what part of the body and the location that is being affected. And for that reason, that physical wound is here. As you can see, we have multiple different victims, but a lot of them are all within the same area in the same region. And that is affecting the temporal lobe with access to the auditory and optical systems. So here, they are more connecting into the auricular temporal nerve and the zygomatic temporal nerve as well. Now I'm going to be working on the gentleman over here. So if we pay attention from the left side to the right side, we could also tell different symmetries. What's symmetrical? What's asymmetrical? And different components within the, sorry, I had a phone call, the directed energy weapon systems. So as we move on, we can see the different heat signatures. The physical examination portion is done here. Now we're going to get into the thermal scan. Taking 3 sets of thermal images. I always take 3 sets, different colors as well. You don't want just the heat. You want black and white versus black. You could even take the 4th color and do different indigo colors as well. Different examinations show different types of features, and that I'll be talking about in a little bit as well. With the thermal imaging, it actually examines thermal conductivity and matches the physical wounds in those spots and locations. Here we see a little ultraviolet light going on over here. We also see some components connecting directly into the temple here as well. Those would be precision laser marks. And then we have ultraviolet wounds, which I'll be talking about in a little bit as well. Now, since directed energy covers the whole electromagnetic spectrum within the radiation, you do need the multiple images to identify the weapon systems. When you're scanning children, this usually takes less time than that hour and a half mark because they're smaller and they don't have as many, they're not fully grown yet. So really you only need to take a set of 15 to 20 in comparison to an adult, where you should probably take about 150 to 200 photos. So depending on the size of the child, it would take less time, and their age and how tall they are too. So this also can be done on animals as well. We could find out key information inside that animal, where that chip is located inside that animal, or you could even identify different problem areas, or if they're getting hit with directed energy weapons as well. Now there are some more hard things to determine, for instance, like the hair. If you have a lot of hair, especially with dogs, it does take a little bit more examination time to go through, because you have to make sure that any of the pulses from the weapon systems are not manipulated by curly hair or some other feature, especially if it's a black and white dog. You wouldn't want to use black and white versus black on their skin. You might want to do more of a heat on the animal instead of that component, because it would be harder to pick up the energy weapon systems on that. So the room settings do change, do per person. And usually when I'm taking the thermal scans, I make sure that it's in complete darkness. And this is because the LED light bulbs absorb into our bodies every single day. That's why they say to have screen protectors on your screens and your computer systems. That is because the radiation from the LED light bulbs with direct use we're absorbing that energy, we're absorbing that ultraviolet light. It gets into our body systems. So making sure that they're fully off and that they've been standing in a room for at least a half an hour with the lights off to maintain that, to make sure that there's no problems or interconnections with the thermal imager and the body system. It gives your body a chance to cool down into a cool atmosphere and to release that heat that is extending from your body or that has been absorbed within your body. So making sure that you're inside a room that is complete darkness. Now, I know if you're doing group settings, it is a little bit harder. You can turn down the curtains and make sure that the light is off at all times. So there are different accommodations, but make sure that you're setting the room appropriately in order to release that energy and that heat from that person's body. The physical wounds can heal, but the radiation does stay in there anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. And that is because it's radiation is a form of cancer. So, or it's projected as cancer. So it could stay with inside of your system up to 4 months time frame. Let's see. Within the thermal imager, there are different precision laser weapon systems, especially along the areolo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that. I'm so sorry. I'm not a medical doctor or physician. Auricular temporal nerve and zygomatico temporal nerve systems. And when we conduct that into the eye, uh, you can see small different lesions along here that connect into the eye as well. There's also small little pulses if you're looking very closely within the white line that is connecting into the nose or the infraorbital nervous system down here along this region as well. So examining the thermal images is not really easy at times, and that's why it's always good to take multiple sets, multiple different angles, because if you cannot see it from one angle, you should be able to see it or capture it at a different angle. And talking about the thermal imaging, there are key effects. So, for instance, like the red down here, the 87.8, that is the hottest point in the body. The room temperature is the coldest area inside the room. And these dots will, you could turn them off, but sometimes they help me pinpoint different spots and locations on there. And they're not necessary, but it's good for court purposes because then you could validate the conditions of the room. Was it within a normal range? Was it within that 65 range, or was it within that 75? Because they have different standardized practices. And if you're not using the standardized practice, then you're not going to be able to pass inside of a court system. So the coldest area inside of the room, as you can see, its offset is actually 63.8. And that could be because the AC kicked on. Every room has different AC components. So you want to make sure that you're taking notes of your victims with the directed energy. Where's the AC unit? Where is the AC going to be blowing directly onto the victim? Remember, those aerosols, those mist, and those particles can be picked up by the thermal imager as well. So you got to make sure that any of those type of things within the atmosphere and inside of that room don't interfere or cause results from the thermal imaging from the directed energy weapon system. So always make sure that you're notating where these devices are and where you're placing the victim or making them stand. That way you could tell as you could tell, it's off here. I always made sure that they were standing away from the AC unit and that it was in the opposite corner from them. So, but there are going to be areas and sometimes with victims that you don't have a space more than 10 feet away from each other. So you have to accumulate and you have to accommodate for other situations and things that occur too as well. So the 87 is a normal range. That's at the spot that you're aiming at. So if you're aiming at a particular spot, the thermal imager will pick up on that spot and location, and then it will signify it over here. This is talking about the energy levels and the battery. And these are the heat sources. So they go from extremely hot to very cold. And so if I was aiming at this spot, which was within the yellow spectrum here, it's 80.7, we can determine an average between the medium of all of your spectrums on here or your numbers. So you would accumulate that and you could find out the different ranges for each of the colors. So there is a little bit of math involved. I know people don't like math, but if you want to make sure, like let's say I'm looking in this area, well, it's colder than that 87.8, we need to find a rough estimate. So you would want to be able to find the medium inside of that spot and location and match up the spectrum fields with that. So now examining the weapon systems, not all the time is it you're using these color spectrums because the electromagnetic spectrum has its own spectrum. So this would be the infrared with the thermal imaging spectrum that we're identifying. And a lot of these are going to be only through the visible range, but they're still the invisible range. And the other directed weapon systems and the radiation levels have their own spectrum as well. So you're not really paying attention. Sorry, excuse me about that. You're really not paying attention to the bar. You want to pay attention to it only at certain moments, but a lot of the radiation, like for especially with the microwave pulses, you're going to look more in the green and yellow spectrums than you're going to be looking into any of the white zones, because remember, it picks up on a lot of pain, a lot of heat that is going on, and inflammation within specific areas of the body, and trying to determine particular body parts and locations to those nervous systems. So that's part of the thermal examination. Now, currently at this time, I am the only person in the world that is doing thermal tomography with the use of directed energy weapons, at least identifying it and within a thermal tomography standpoint. I did have the Department of Energy call me and contact me. They have one of my reports. They're reviewing it right now, and we might be able to come up with a standardized practice for the Havana Center victims. So I'm really excited about this. I'm looking forward to working with them if they choose me. So I really think that this is a prominent cause here. So right now I could identify up to 29 different weapon systems. And there are over 10,000 different weapon systems. Different lasers are being used, different microwave components, and each one uses different radio transmitters, ultraviolet light. They have X-ray technology systems out there as well. All the weapon systems are interchangeable, which means that each physical attribute with the thermal images are identified separately. Now, so far, I've only discovered about 29 of these, but it can prove the different locations of manipulations and the experiences from these weapon systems and how they're accessing the bodies and attacks on that person. So, proper research is needed to identify weapon systems. So I talked about how there was over 10,000 and different weapon systems. So identifying all these weapon systems are not easy, especially when some of them actually look the same as others. So for instance, here we have electro or optoelectric battlefield surveillance system. These are going to be your EOIR sensors that are within inside of your drones. So they're the built-in camera systems. These are your proximity sensors, your military drones, FLIR thermal imaging. It could be built-in surveillance for tracking and positioning systems and GPS locations as well. Now, most of the weapon systems do associate on the body with these forms of laser weapons. And as you can tell, there are different ones for each things, and each one goes into different categories, and they have different effects, such as pulse generation or CW. CW stands for continuous wave. We were talking about that. Cross-section modulation is down here at the bottom with that F. It's that cross-section. Those work well with different excimer lasers, technology system, ultraviolet light, XUV, fluoroscopy, weapon systems. They could also help with halogen, the bulbs, the LED components as well with that too. And as you can see, the different wavelengths with the different laser pointers, the beam riders, and the dazzlers, those could be picked up on a visible spectrum scale. Remember, I was talking about with the infrared camera that you have invisible spectrums and you have invisible spectrums. So this would be one of those visible components that can be picked up on the camera system and used with the beam spot. So those are key to identify because those could help you coordinate with the different type of weapon system that's being used. Dazzlers are illegal. They were banned even by the Department of Defense, but they are still doing research on them. Dazzlers are meant to damage the eye. And as you can see, they have a particular foot. They have a different range for the eyes, but you can damage the eyes with, or a person could even go blind with a dazzler. I know in NATO, they have rules and regulations about that, especially in warfare too. So, but I know the United States for a fact is still doing testing with the dazzler systems and human experimentations on there. So each weapon system is identified that matches the thermal images, and it can produces a shape inside of that thermal image. And our job here, or my job here, is to identify what type of shape, what type of weapon system, and what does that weapon system do. And we could work on shielding at a different later time for the victim and maybe come up with some type of component to help them out a little bit more. I've been calling them cross grids in my report, not cross sections. That's my failure. You know, I'm not perfect, but at least I recognize my failures and my faults, and I can admit to my mistakes, and then I can learn from my mistakes and then identify it properly. So there is a lot of learning inside of this, and sometimes I have to go back and I have to retrace my steps, and I have to go back to that original person, be like, okay, and then I would have to fix that report, and then because I identified something different in it. So it's always a learning capability, and there are going to be problem areas and solutions, especially when you're trying to identify the different types of weapon systems in there. So for instance, one of my failures and mistakes was a gyroscope. Here we have a white and black version of the weapon systems, and here I identified a triangle. I've dealt with a little bit of identifying gyroscopes before. Gyroscopes are usually a transitional weapon system. It's always in a triangular shape, but there are different components. I've identified 4 different types. For instance, you might have microwave pulses on each point. You might have laser ones on each point. Most of these are used for precision and medical purposes out here. So one of my mistakes was looking at the triangle. I was configuring it with some form of gyroscope. Well, at first glance, that was because of the maser weapon that is due on top of it. But I also noticed that it wasn't really identifiable on the heat signature spot in the location. Although it was a closer area in shot, we could still see the maser weapon, but we can't identify the different input and outputs of it. So what I did was I was coming across and doing a little bit of research, and I found information on the anamorphic prism pairs and elliptical beams. Now, this is from X-ray technology sources, and I had to go back to my thermal imager and find my output. So, and I did find my output. I was focused up here on this top when I didn't realize there was an output right down here at the bottom. So here we were able to pick up the elliptical beams and what they're used for. Now this is an act of God shot. I like to call it a little act of God shot because this type of beam is only used or captured when transitioning. They can change the beam shape to match the weapon system, or sorry, not matching the weapon system. The weapon system is the deployment, but the beam from that weapon system changes, and they could change the different headings through the different lenses with the different colors of the weapon systems. For instance, like laser technology systems, they have the different frequencies, they have the different colors, wavelengths within side of the spectrums. So what this particular pair does, it circularizes the elliptical beams and it transforms the beams into circular profiles. And this range, it could also change the range in the size. So you can make it larger or you can make it smaller. This has to deal with particularly in reshaping the light as a refraction point, and it's in one axis, and then it compensates for the divergence in the original beam. So basically, this was a transitional shot, and they were in the process of changing the beam over in order to hit the different spot and location. Now, since I take different thermal images and different spots all the time, I constantly change it up. It was easy to capture that. So as you could tell, that it was mainly captured on the ultraviolet light and the X-ray spectrums, but not really picked up on the heat signature. So when you're doing the shots, you want to make sure that you do comparisons side by side with each other and making sure that what you're capturing is actually what you're capturing on there. This is one of my favorite ones. This is XUV lasers. This is how we build up the thermal imaging. As you can see, we have 2 of the same shots, 2 different color spectrums here. Once again, this is because it is ultraviolet light and X-ray shadowing over here. Now here we could determine the beam size. Now I've figured this out that this is a Gaussian beam right here. And Gaussian mode has 12 different modes. Now, this is not the mode that they were using, but this is, there's actually 3 sets of Gaussian beams. And each one has different 12 modes to them. So this is why I say there's over 10,000 different weapon systems. and trying to identify these weapon systems to the best of our capabilities. As you could see, that when we build it up, that little weapon system, you can create a 3D image on it. And we could determine the precise location of where they're attacking inside the body, which they're connecting into the cone of the eye for the optical imaging spot. And they're also going into the infraorbital nerve here, or I believe that's the infracochlear nerve down here at the bottom. But by the shape of it, we can determine what type of lens that they're using and determine what type of optical system that they're using as well. That's one of the key components for identifying the weapon systems. So if you look at the shape of the lens, we can identify the lens, what area of the body that they're hitting and focusing on. Now, one thing that I noticed here within the ultraviolet light is that this is actually also a solid state. This is not pulsated. You can see two rings down here that connect over here on the left-hand side from the right spot images here. And they are solid based. So that tells me that it is a solid state weapon system. And it would use some form of continuous wave to pulsate those weapon systems. So we could also determine what type through the different measurements and measuring them out inside of the component. So it's pretty fun and interesting when you're trying to learn how to identify these weapon systems and focusing on it. Now, one of the key components to identifying X-rays has to deal with the shadows. These are mainly absorbed from the radiation into the tissues, into the bones, and they cast that shadow on that area that is being focused. We also have a XUV weapon system that was identified right here. Notice the shape. Once again, we have a different optical lens here. It's a round circular. It's solid state, and the shadow is a solid state too. But we cannot see it on the black and white area. We could only identify that portion of it on the white versus black. And that's because of the shadow components on here. And that helps with identifying X-ray technology systems. So the X-ray technology systems, this is mainly hitting with inside the frontal lobe here. There are also no pulses. Once again, these are solid states for the Gaussian beams, but notice that there's no really odd shape within that wavelength there. There's no pulses intermitting through there. It is a solid shape with the X-ray imaging system. So depending on the X-ray, they usually have different shadow effects from white, gray, and black shadowing features on there. So they're usually going to be a solid component. That could be, this could be done in real time. X-ray laser technology systems can be done in real time. They're either in static, they have live images. It could also be through 3D imaging, and that has to deal with the building blocks of mapping out a person's body and hitting them with the weapon system and affecting the different limbs, the speech, the associations with there. They could also have electrons. They create positive charge ions, which damage that tissue and the atomic structures in there. So another form of X-ray laser technology systems with that is fluoroscopy. And that's a piece of medical equipment that is used by the X-ray scans and the imaging machines and the pulses, and that uses low pulses and beam from that type of real-time technology system on there. So different areas cause different things. A lot of these also have to deal with photoelectronics as well. And you can determine different effects like Rayleigh scattering, which does cause vibrations inside of the body. Now, Rayleigh scattering is a different type of X-ray ultra laser weapon system. And that also coincides with signal to noise ratio systems as well. This can be detected usually in when they're in a person is inhaling or exhaling, they can manipulate different airflow inside of the body. That's actually called the MIST, MIST. That's multimodal intraspecal tracking. So with tracking MIST technology systems from the pharmaceutical side, they're able to tell the flow manipulation inside the body and use signal to noise ratios with the X-ray imaging and fluoroscopy technology systems to manipulate a person's body. So I know that kind of seems a little out there, but this stuff is real, it really exists, and so forth. Another way that X-ray technology systems can be amplified is through their vacuum tubes. A lot of them you can determine if it's the type of system or a detection system which can be picked up by radiography. So a lot of these different technology systems can be proven and identified, and it just depends on how you're identifying it and what features and characteristics that you're looking at. Now, with the Gaussian beams, like I said, there's about 3 different sets of different modes here. This one, it wasn't captured in any of the images, thermal imaging yet, but they do have similarities. Like, for instance, here with the Gaussian beam, it's a round circular, but here it has more of a square pattern, even with the cross section. And there are also no laser points at the edges here. So those would have a dark spot out in the middle here too. So when identifying, you got to make sure that you're not misrepresenting any of the weapon systems, and it can take a timely fashion. So I believe that is the end of my slide and my presentation. I'd like you to thank you for inviting me, and I open the floor for any form of investigation.